If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. I need to give you a content warning on this episode. In this episode, there is some sexual content. There's no sexual violence, but there are specific sexual details. There's also some anti-Semitic views. They are not my own. And there's some violence. So this is an episode that you might not want the kiddos around for. So I just thought I would give you a little heads up before we get started on the episode. All right, now let's begin. The person I'm about to tell you about was complex. He's probably the most complex person that I have covered yet. He was seen as a leader by many. A leader that was trying to lead his people out of the darkest dark. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 25th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, United States. His mother was Louise Langdon and his father was Earl Little. Malcolm was one of 11 children. His siblings were Robert, Mary, Ella, Wilford, Hilda, Filbert, Reginald, Wesley, Yvonne, and Earl Jr. Malcolm was 5th in the birth order. Malcolm's brothers Wilford and Filbert also took X as their surname, but more on that later on. Malcolm's 3 oldest siblings were by his father and his father's first wife, Dorothy Mason. Earl lived in Georgia with Dorothy and their children. Earl ended up leaving his first wife and his children in Georgia. When Malcolm was just a toddler, his family moved to Lansing, Michigan. Malcolm and his family moved from Omaha in 1928 because they were threatened by the KKK. They first traveled to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then they moved to Lansing. Their first house was lost to fire. Earl blamed it on Black Legion, that was a KKK-like group. Earl then purchased a 6-acre plot just south of the city. Malcolm was young when he lost his father. On September 28, 1931, Earl was killed by a streetcar. It was ruled an accident, but it's possible that Earl was murdered by the KKK-like group, the Black Legion. Malcolm fully believed that his father was murdered. Malcolm's 4 uncles also died at the hands of white men. One of Earl's insurance policies did not pay because they ruled his death a suicide. Life for the Littles was very rough after Earl's death. They were extremely poor. Sometimes the only thing that Louise had to feed her children were dandelion greens from the street. Her sons hunted so meat could be put on the table. Louise's mental health declined. She was committed to an insane asylum in 1939. The cause for her breakdown was she had been seeing a man and she got pregnant by him. He took off when she became pregnant. Malcolm and his siblings were separated. Some went to family members' homes and some went to foster homes. Before Malcolm became a ward of the state, he roamed the streets. The young Malcolm got mixed up in criminal activity. He started doing things like selling reefers. Malcolm ended up getting arrested. There was a trial and he became a ward of the state. He was assigned to a white family's supervision in a boarding/detention home in Mason, Michigan. There in Mason, Malcolm attended junior high school. He was the only black kid at his school. He was surrounded by about 300 white students. At school, Malcolm did well, both academically and socially. He was so charming that he was elected class president. It was there in junior high when Malcolm started to dream about his future. Malcolm decided that he wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up. His dreams were quickly crushed when his English teacher found out what he was aspiring to be. Malcolm was told that he needed to aim lower because his aspirations were not realistic for someone like him. The English teacher used a racial slur that I am not going to repeat. The English teacher told Malcolm that he should be a carpenter instead. That devastated the young Malcolm. His interaction with his teacher made Malcolm lose interest in school. In 1940, Malcolm spent the summer in Roxbury. That is a section of Boston, Massachusetts. He stayed there with his half-sister Ella. Malcolm loved the black nightlife in Boston. He went back to Mason in the autumn and he moved in with one of the few black families in Mason. He once again took to street life. He began openly dating white girls and also men. Now, before I go any further, it is true that a lot of people have tried to hide the fact that Malcolm was queer. I use the word queer because we don't know if he was bisexual, pansexual, or gay. So I'm going to use queer like I did in the King James VI and 1st episodes. The Nation of Islam, which I will get to that later on, the Nation of Islam has tried to cover up Malcolm's sexuality. But the Nation of Islam is homophobic. So they wouldn't admit if Malcolm had been LGBTQ. Malcolm's daughter, Ilyasa, has also talked about her doubt that her father was LGBTQ. She thinks that if her father would have been, then she would have known. But I have my doubts that even if Ilyasah knew Malcolm had been LGBTQ, I don't think she would have admitted it. Because when she denied her father being bisexual, she used a homophobic slur that I'm not going to repeat. In Bruce Perry's biography of Malcolm, he went into detail about Malcolm's sexual encounters with men. I debated on how much detail I would go into, but I think it's important that I go into great detail here because there are some that want to deny Malcolm's sexuality. This is why I gave a content warning on this episode, and I have never intended for this podcast to be a kid friendly podcast. I have, since the very first episode, aimed this podcast at a more mature audience. If you are not new here, you already know this. If you are new here, hello, welcome. This is the podcast. So, some people around Malcolm knew that he was sexually active with men. A schoolmate of Malcolm's, Bob Beebe, said that one day he and Malcolm caught a boy masturbating, and Malcolm ordered the boy to give him a hand job. Then Malcolm gave the boy a blowjob. Malcolm became a prostitute when he was 20 years old. Malcolm would sleep with other men for money. He would brag to people about this, and Malcolm didn't need to do this. He had other ways of making money. He was dealing dope, he was stealing, and he was a pimp. Malcolm didn't need to be a prostitute. Malcolm later became a butler to a wealthy man named William Paul Lennon. Malcolm's friend, Malcolm Jarvis, said that Malcolm was paid to sprinkle William with talcum powder and bring him to orgasm. When Malcolm lived in Flint, Michigan, his roommate said that Malcolm would often sneak down the hall to spend the night with a gay cross-dresser named Willie Mae. I think that there are just too many accounts of Malcolm having sexual relations with men, and the details are just too specific for there not to be truth to it. So going back to when Malcolm was 15 years old, he dropped out of school. Then there was a court petition that removed Malcolm from the house he was living at, and they put him in a stricter black household. The following year, 1941, Malcolm went to go live with his half-sister, Ella. Malcolm got a job as a shoeshine boy at the Roseland State Ballroom. But his job didn't keep him from the street life. He became known as Detroit Red because he had reddish hair. He became a drug dealer and the leader of a gang of thieves in Roxbury and Harlem. Ella got Malcolm a job on a railroad. He began working in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Malcolm was a sandwich man on the New York, Hartford, and New Haven Railroad's Yankee Clipper from Boston to New York's Grand Central Station. Malcolm became mesmerized with Harlem. He called it Seventh Heaven. The autumn of 1942 was not a good time for Malcolm. He lost his job with the railroad because of his erratic behavior due to his alcohol and marijuana use. White people complained about his behavior, so the railroad let him go. Then he got a job as a sweeper on the Seaboard Line's Silver Meteor from New York to Florida. But he was also fired from that job for the same reason he was fired from the railroad. He went back to Harlem after he lost that job, and he got a job at a restaurant called Small's Paradise. Malcolm then lost that job when he introduced a serviceman to one of his friends that was a prostitute. So it was autumn of 1943. Malcolm was 18 years old and he was back to selling reefers and working at night at a speakeasy. During this time, World War II was going on, so Malcolm got summoned by the local draft board for military service. Malcolm did not want to go to war, so he acted like he was mentally unstable. He acted well enough to be declared mentally disqualified for military service. Malcolm returned to Boston in late of 1945. There, he and four accomplices committed a series of burglaries that targeted wealthy white families. In 1946, Malcolm got caught when he was picking up a stolen watch he had left at a repair shop. In February of 1946, he was convicted of larceny and breaking and entering. He was 20 years old and he was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison. Malcolm was first sent to Charlestown State Prison, that is in Boston, Massachusetts. Then, 2 years later, he was sent to Norfolk Prison Colony. That prison is also in Massachusetts. He was transferred to Norfolk because in Charlestown he met fellow inmate John Brimbury, and John encouraged Malcolm to read. So Malcolm started studying the dictionary, reading, and participating in English and Latin courses. Because of this, Malcolm's half sister Ella began a letter writing campaign to get him transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony. They had a reputation for inmate educational programs that had ties to colleges like Harvard, Emerson, and Boston University. Then Malcolm started writing letters how he wanted to further his education. Because of this, Malcolm was transferred on March 31st, 1948. Malcolm described Norfolk as, quote, comparatively a heaven in many respects, end quote. At Norfolk, he had his own cell and he found he had a love for debating and speaking to a crowd. His rebuttal to a debate on the abolishment of capital punishment was featured in Norfolk newsletter, The Colony 5. In his cell, he would study dictionaries. He would copy and review words until he could read and write with ease. This made him feel like a brand new person. He said, quote, "It is as though someone else I knew of had lived by hustling and crime," end quote. While he was in prison, some of his siblings wrote to him about the Nation of Islam. This new religious movement was preaching black self-reliance. The Nation of Islam combines elements of Islam and black nationalism. It was founded in 1931 by Wallace D. Farr. He believed that Africans were morally and culturally superior over whites. He urged African Americans to renounce Christianity because it was a tool of the oppressors. It promotes the idea that God is man and man is God. It teaches that God has a presence inside human beings. It teaches that the black race is God. I want to note here that the Nation of Islam and Islam are different. Many Muslims have said that the Nation of Islam's teachings are not authentically Islamic. Malcolm stayed at Norfolk until March 23rd, 1950, and then he was sent back to Charlestown because he refused to cooperate with prison inoculation policies. At first, when Malcolm's siblings started teaching him about the Nation of Islam, he wasn't sold on it. But his brother Reginald started telling him how the Nation of Islam views white people as devils, and Malcolm actually struggled to get on board with that idea. But then he thought about his past interactions with white people, and they were not good. Now, I am not here to try and spread an ideology. I'm just here to tell you about dead people. So just because I cover someone doesn't mean I agree with everything they believed. I know I have said that in previous episodes, but I'm going to repeat that statement every time something like this comes up. Malcolm was so hostile towards Christians in prison that he earned the nickname Satan. Malcolm wrote to the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, in 1948. Elijah told him to renounce his past, humbly bow in prayer to God, and promise never to engage in destructive behavior again. In 1950, the FBI opened a file on Malcolm because he wrote a letter from prison to President Harry S. Truman. In the letter, Malcolm expressed his opposition to the Korean War, and he declared himself a communist. This was when he started using the name Malcolm X. Malcolm did this because this was what Elijah instructed his followers to do. He instructed them to leave behind their surnames and use X instead. This sounds a little culty, and in fact, others have accused the Nation of Islam as being a cult, including former members of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm said in his autobiography that the X symbolized the true African family name that he could never know. He said, quote, "For me, my X replaced the white slave master name of Little, which some blue-eyed devil named Little had imposed upon my parental forebears." End quote. Malcolm was released from prison in 1952. After his parole in August of 1952, Malcolm headed to Chicago to go visit Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm was named assistant minister of the nation's Temple Number 1 in Detroit. Then he established Boston's Temple Number 11 later that year. Then in March of 1954, he expanded Temple Number 12 in Philadelphia. And in May of that year, he was selected to lead Temple Number 7 in Harlem. Malcolm's success caught the attention of the FBI. In 1953, the FBI began surveillancing him. They thought that Malcolm may have had communist associations. Malcolm continued to thrive in the Nation of Islam. In 1955, Malcolm recruited new members to the Nation of Islam. Malcolm established temples in Springfield, Massachusetts. That was Temple Number 13. He also established temples 14 and 15 in Hartford, Connecticut, and Atlanta, Georgia, respectively. Hundreds of African Americans were joining the Nation of Islam because of Malcolm. Malcolm kept giving lectures on the Nation of Islam. In 1955, there was a woman named Betty Sanders at one of those lectures. Betty met Malcolm after that lecture. Betty was in her second year of nursing school when she met Malcolm, whom one writer described as mesmerizingly handsome and always spotlessly well-groomed. Betty was invited to a dinner party at the Nation of Islam Temple in Harlem by a nurse's aide. At that dinner party, Betty also met Malcolm again. Betty became a regular at Malcolm's lectures. Betty joined the Nation of Islam in 1956, and she changed her name to Betty X. The Nation of Islam was against couples having dates alone, so Malcolm and Betty had to court each other at group events. Malcolm would invite Betty on group visits that he led to New York City's museums and libraries. On a phone call in January of 1958, Malcolm proposed to Betty while he was in Detroit. 2 days later, on January 14th, the two were married in Michigan. Together, Malcolm and Betty had 6 daughters. Their daughters were Atola, born on November 16th, 1958. Kulela, born on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1960. Ilyasa, born on July 22nd, 1962. Gamila La Moonla, born in 1964. And twin girls, Malika and Malik, born in 1965. Malcolm became a public figure in 1957. A member of the Nation of Islam, Hinton Johnson, was beaten by 2 New York City police officers on April 26th. Hinton and 2 other Nation of Islam members witnessed the officers beating an African American man with nightsticks. The men tried to stop the assault by yelling out, quote, "You're not in Alabama, this is New York," end quote. One of the officers began beating Hinton. He suffered brain contusions and subdural hemorrhaging due to the beating. All 4 of the African American men were arrested. Malcolm and a small group of members from the Nation of Islam went to the police station and they demanded to see Hinton. They first denied that Hinton was there, but then about 500 people gathered outside of the station. Then the police let Malcolm see Hinton. Malcolm insisted that Hinton be taken to the hospital after he spoke with him, and Hinton was taken to Harlem Hospital. He was treated, and by the time that he returned to the station, about 4,000 were outside. Malcolm and an attorney were making bail arrangements for 2 of the men. Hinton was not bailed, and the police said that he could not go back to the hospital until he was arraigned the next day. Malcolm walked out of the station and gave the crowd a hand signal, and the crowd left. Within the next month, New York City Police Department had Malcolm under surveillance. They asked authorities in other cities that Malcolm had lived in and prisons that he had done time in about him. A grand jury did not indict the officers that beat Hinton. The police department assigned undercover officers to infiltrate the Nation of Islam. Malcolm continued to become more and more popular. His comments on issues and events were widely being reported on. In 1959, he was featured in a New York City television broadcast about the Nation of Islam called The Hate That Hate Produced. Malcolm continued to spread the teachings of the Nation of Islam, beliefs like black people are the original people of the world, white people are devils, and that the demise of the white race is imminent. In the late 1950s, Malcolm started using a new name. It was Malcolm Shabazz, or El Hajjah Malik El Shabazz, which means the Pilgrim Malcolm the Patriarch. But he was still mainly referred to as Malcolm X. At the United Nations General Assembly in September of 1960, Malcolm was invited to official functions by several African nations. He met Jamal Abdul Nasser of Egypt, Ahmed Sekou Touré of Guinea, and Kenneth Kaunda of the Zambian African National Congress. Malcolm also met with Fidel Castro. Fidel is making another appearance this season. Remember, he first showed up in one of the Eleanor Roosevelt episodes. So did Harry S. Truman. So Malcolm met with Fidel. Fidel was impressed with Malcolm, and he even invited him to Cuba. Not everyone was a fan of Malcolm, though. The NAACP and other civil rights organizations denounced him and the Nation of Islam, which makes sense because the civil rights movement was fighting for equal rights, and the Nation of Islam didn't allow its members to vote or be involved in politics in any way. And the feeling was mutual. Malcolm wasn't a fan of the civil rights movement. He wasn't besties with Martin Luther King Jr. He didn't want racial integration. He called the 1963 March on Washington the farce on Washington. He also wasn't a supporter of the nonviolence approach of the civil rights movement. He believed African Americans should defend themselves in any way possible. He was also a supporter of African Americans moving back to Africa or creating a separate America. Malcolm was also anti-Semitic, and I would love to tell you that eventually he had an Eleanor Roosevelt moment in his life where he changed his anti-Semitic ways, but he did not. His autobiography's co-author, Alex Haley, actually had to edit out some of his negative comments about Jews in Malcolm's manuscript. Malcolm believed Jews were evil and that they brought the Holocaust on themselves. He called them bloodsuckers. Malcolm even spoke at a rally with George Lincoln Rockwell, which, if you don't know who George was, this is what you need to know about him. George was a piece of shit, an absolute bastard. George was head of the American Nazi Party. If you ever wondered who came up with white power, well, it was George. George has basically inspired all modern-day domestic terrorism in America. You can definitely see a line from George to Timothy McVeigh, from George to Dylan Roof. I just got done, coincidentally, listening to 3 episodes of the podcast Behind the Bastard about George. I highly recommend that podcast. Malcolm did a lot for the Nation of Islam. He really helped their numbers grow. He got the boxer Muhammad Ali to join. Malcolm's love for the Nation of Islam did not last forever, though. In 1961, Nation of Islam members and the police in South Central Los Angeles had some violent confrontations. A lot of the members were arrested, but they were acquitted. Just after midnight on April 27, 1962, 2 LAPD officers shoved and beat several members outside of Temple Number 27. Angry members came out of the mosque. Officers tried to intimidate them. One officer was disarmed, and his partner was shot in the elbow by a third officer. More than 70 officers arrived as backup. They raided the mosque, beat members, and even shot 7 of them, including Ronald Stokes. Ronald was shot from behind while raising his hands over his head to surrender. He died from his gunshot wound. Many members were indicted for this, but no officers were. It was ruled that Ronald's killing was justified. Malcolm wanted revenge. He wanted members to act violently towards the officers. Elijah Muhammad did not support this. Then Malcolm started to want to work with the civil rights movement, black politicians, and other religious groups. But Elijah did not want that. Elijah Muhammad was accused of having extramarital affairs with young Nation of Islam secretaries. This was supposed to be a violation of the Nation of Islam's teachings. There was pressure put on Malcolm to cover up the scandal. Malcolm made a comment about John F. Kennedy's assassination on December 1st, 1963. He said that it was a case of chickens coming home to roost. He said that, quote, chickens coming home to roost never did make me sad. They've always made me glad, end quote. The public got angry. The Nation of Islam sent condolences to the Kennedy family and ordered its ministers not to comment on the assassination. Malcolm was prohibited from speaking in public for 90 days. There was some jealousy issues that arose between Malcolm and Elijah. Malcolm's star started to shine brighter than Elijah's, and this got under Elijah's skin. The journalist Louis Lomax wrote a book about the Nation of Islam titled When the Word is Given, and he used a photo of Malcolm on his cover, and he used 5 of Malcolm's speeches, but he only used one of Elijah's speeches. Malcolm started to believe that the Nation of Islam was built on lies. Malcolm got his mother out of the mental hospital in 1963. On March 8th, 1964, Malcolm publicly announced that he was breaking from the Nation of Islam. He also said that he wanted to work with other civil rights leaders. Malcolm was now a Sunni Muslim. Malcolm tried to get Muhammad Ali to convert to Sunni Islam, but he was unsuccessful. Muhammad ended up cutting ties with Malcolm. Muhammad said that the decision to cut ties with Malcolm was something that he regretted. Malcolm did meet with Martin Luther King Jr. once, and it was very briefly. It was only long enough to have a few photos taken. That was on March 26, 1967 in Washington, D.C. They were both attending the Senate's debate on the Civil Rights Bill. In April of that year, Malcolm gave a speech titled "The Ballot or the Bullet." In this speech, he encouraged African Americans to vote, but he also told them that they should take up arms if necessary. Malcolm then toured Africa in July. Malcolm had a strong hatred for Maurice Zoom of the Congo. Maurice was a wealthy plantation owner, and he hired forces to kill the Congo's first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. The forces he hired were 10,000 Belgian troops. Patrice asked the United Nations to send peacekeepers, but instead they backed the Belgian troops. Patrice was arrested and he was handed to Maurice and he was killed. On November 24th, 1964, U.S. Air Force escorts ferried 600 Belgian paratroopers in an attack on Stanleyville on an alleged humanitarian rescue mission to save white hostages. Thousands of Congolese were killed in the attack. So many bodies were left in the street that there was a typhoid epidemic. Malcolm called Maurice the worst African ever born. Malcolm accused the United States of imperialism in the Congo for supporting Maurice. On December 3rd, 1964, Malcolm took part in a debate at the Oxford Union Society. In the debate, he was in an agreement with the U.S. presidential candidate Barry Goldwater that extremism is just in the defense of liberty. So many people were interested in the debate that BBC televised it. In the debate, Malcolm talked about how he hated the term Black Muslim. He wanted to be known as a Muslim that just happened to be black. He also brought up the Congo. He said that he hated how the Anglo-American press portrayed the Congo as primitive, cannibalistic savages. He called out the Cuban pilots hired by the CIA that bombed villages and towns, killing women and children. He also called Maurice a cold-blooded killer. On February 8th, 1965, he addressed the first meeting of the Council of African Organizations in London. He tried to go to France, but he was denied entry. When Malcolm broke from the Nation of Islam, it was not a clean break. Malcolm received threats from them. In February of 1964, Malcolm's car was bombed by the leader of Temple No. 7. The next month, Elijah Muhammad told the Boston minister, Louis X, that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. The black Muslim newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, had a cartoon of Malcolm's bouncing severed head in their April 10th edition. The FBI surveillance recorded a telephone call on June 8th where Betty told Malcolm that he was as good as dead. The FBI got a tip 4 days later that Malcolm was going to be bumped off. The Nation of Islam sued to reclaim Malcolm's home in Queens, New York. Malcolm and his family was ordered to vacate, but on February 14th, 1965, the night before a hearing on postponing the eviction, there was a fire that destroyed the home. In the December 4th issue of Muhammad Speaks, Lewis X wrote that Malcolm was worthy of death. Malcolm told interviewer Gordon Parks on February 19th, 1965, that the Nation of Islam was trying to kill him. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm was about to address the OAAU and someone yelled, "N-word, get your hand out of my pocket." Except they didn't say N-word. Malcolm and his bodyguards tried to calm the situation down, but then a man rushed forward and shot Malcolm in the chest with a shot-off shotgun, and 2 other men fired semi-automatic handguns. Malcolm died at the hospital at 3:30 p.m. He was 39 years old. He had 21 gunshots to his chest, left shoulder, arms, and legs. One gunman and Nation of Islam member, Talmadge Hayer, aka Thomas Hagen, was beaten by the crowd before the cops arrived. Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson were identified as the other 2 gunmen. They were all found guilty of murder in March of 1966 and sentenced to life in prison. Talmadge confessed to the murder, but said that Norman and Thomas were not the other 2 gunmen, though he did not name the other 2. In 1977 and 1978, he signed affidavits that Norman and Thomas were innocent. He named 4 other Nation of Islam members, but the case was never reopened. Norman was paroled in 1985. He maintained that he was innocent. Thomas was released in 1987. He also maintained that he was innocent until he died in August of 2009. Talmadge was paroled in 2010. Thomas and Talmadge both left the Nation of Islam. Norman was exonerated of his murder convictions in 2021. On July 14th, 2022, he filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Brooklyn against New York City for $40 million in damages. Les Payne and Thomas Paine's book, The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X, claim that William 25X, aka William Bradley, Leon Davis, and Talmadge were the assassins. Malcolm's public viewing was on February 23rd through February 26th at Unity Funeral Home in Harlem. 14,000 to 30,000 attended. His funeral was on the 27th. A local television station televised the service. Martin Luther King Jr. was saddened by Malcolm's murder. He said, quote, "While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had a great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem. He was eloquent spokesman for his point of view, and no one can honestly doubt that Malcolm had a great concern for the problems that we face as a race." End quote. Elijah Muhammad said that Malcolm got what he preached. Most of the world was sympathetic. Malcolm was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. Friends took up the grave diggers' shovels to complete the burial themselves. There have been conspiracy theories surrounding Malcolm's death. James Farmer, the leader of Congress of Racial Equality, said that drug dealers killed Malcolm. Others say that the NYPD, the FBI, and the CIA didn't give him adequate protection. Malcolm's family said Lewis X had a hand in Malcolm's death. Even he has admitted that his words may have led to Malcolm's assassination. In August of 2014, an online petition was started using the White House online petition mechanism to have the files relating to Malcolm's murder be released. In January of 2019, there was a public statement calling for Congress or the Justice Department to review the assassinations of Malcolm, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy. In 2023, members of Malcolm's family said that they would file a $100 million wrongful death lawsuit against the CIA, the FBI, and the NYPD. The site where Malcolm's childhood home once was is now a National Historic Place. There is a historical marker at his Lansing, Michigan home. In the United States, Malcolm's birthday is Malcolm X Day. There are many streets in the United States named after him. There are dozens of schools and libraries also named after him. He got a U.S. postage stamp. Columbia University opened the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial Educational Center. On September 12, 2022, Malcolm became the first black man or woman to be voted into the Nebraska Hall of Fame. X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, is an opera about Malcolm. There is a documentary about him titled Malcolm X. Spike Lee made a movie about him. It's also titled Malcolm X. Malcolm has been portrayed in the movies The Greatest, Death of a Prophet, King of the World, Ali, An American Hero, Ali, Betty and Coretta, Selma, and One Night in Miami. He's also been portrayed in the miniseries King, Roots, The Next Generations, Godfather of Harlem, and Genius. He's also been portrayed in the plays The Meeting and One Night in Miami. There have been many books written about him, and I will make a bookshop list of them. And that was the life of Malcolm X. Thank you so much for listening to the 25th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. This was season 4's finale. If you listened to all of season 4's episodes, I want to give you a special thank you. I already know what the theme for the next season is going to be, but I'm not going to reveal it just yet. A few weeks prior to season 4 premiering, I teased what the theme was going to be on TikTok, and that was a lot of fun. So that's what I'm going to do for season 5. But I did leave an Easter egg in this episode to give you a clue as to what the theme for season 5 will be. Speaking of social media, if you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter/X is at History Shelf Pod, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. You are more than welcome to message me on any of those social media platforms. The best way to get to hold of me would be to message me on TikTok. That's where I'm most active. One of you guys did message me on this podcast TikTok, and that was pretty cool. I actually want to hear from you guys. If you want to help support this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that you get the first tier, Plus, you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you'll get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Chef merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippa pudding. I also have a gig on Fiverr that lets you take out ad space on this podcast. There's also some affiliated links that you can click on and buy something. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch and you don't want any of the perks and you don't want to buy anything but you still want to help support the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just said will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next season, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next season.